While American warships were tracking Iranian missile launches in the Persian Gulf, someone else was tracking those same American warships and passing their exact positions to Tehran. Not a spy, not a drone. Russia, Washington Post, confirmed it. 3 American officials confirmed it. Russia's Liana satellite intelligence system was feeding the locations of U.S. military assets, warships, aircraft, positions directly to Iranian forces in real time throughout the conflict. The Pentagon said it wasn't concerned. The White House said it wasn't making a difference. And then the Russian consulate in Isfahan took a direct hit in a U.S.-Israeli airstrike. The relationship between Moscow and Washington in this conflict is not what either government's public statements suggest. Here is what is actually happening between Russia and the United States in this war, and why it matters more than anything else currently being reported. The intelligence sharing arrangement that Washington Post confirmed in early March represented something that no previous conflict between American forces and an Iranian adversary had featured: a major nuclear power actively providing targeting data to the side that was firing at American military personnel. 3 American officials speaking anonymously confirmed that since the war began on February 28th, Russia had been passing Iran the locations of U.S. military assets, including warships and aircraft operating in the Middle East theater. The officials were careful to note that American intelligence had not established that Russia was directing Iran on what to do with the information, drawing a distinction between providing targeting data and issuing targeting orders that was legally and diplomatically significant but operationally thin. If you know where the American carrier strike group is and you have missiles capable of reaching it, the difference between being told where to aim and being given coordinates that tell you the same thing is a distinction that exists in diplomatic language more than in operational reality. The mechanism Russia was using to collect and transmit this intelligence was its Liana space-based reconnaissance system, a satellite constellation designed specifically for maritime surveillance, capable of detecting and tracking surface vessels across ocean-sized areas and providing positional data with sufficient precision for weapons targeting purposes. Ukraine's military intelligence service confirmed separately that Russia was conducting surveillance of American bases in the Middle East and Gulf regions, identifying 7 specific areas that had been surveilled or photographed in a single week, including U.S., Middle Eastern, and British bases in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar, and the U.S.-British base on Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. The geographic scope of the surveillance operation confirmed that Russia was providing Iran with a comprehensive picture of American military positioning across the entire theater, rather than information about specific vessels or specific locations at specific moments. The Pentagon's public response to the confirmation was calibrated to minimize the political consequences of the disclosure, while avoiding a direct denial of what 3 officials had already confirmed. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the United States was tracking everything and factoring it into battle plans. He said the American people could rest assured their commander-in-chief was well aware of who was talking to whom. The White House press secretary said the intelligence sharing was clearly not making any difference because the U.S. was completely decimating Iranian military capacity. Neither statement was a denial. Neither statement addressed the specific question of what the administration intended to do about a nuclear-armed power actively providing targeting data to forces that were killing American military personnel. Trump himself, when asked about the matter at a White House meeting, berated the reporter who raised the question rather than answering it. The Kremlin's response followed the pattern of calibrated ambiguity that Russian official communications had been maintaining throughout the conflict. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov, when asked whether Russia would go beyond political support and offer military assistance to Iran, said there had been no such request from Tehran. When pressed on whether Moscow had provided any military or intelligence assistance since the war began, he declined to comment. Lavrov had already labeled the U.S.-Israeli strikes as unprovoked aggression and called for an immediate ceasefire, establishing Russia's public position as opposed to the conflict without committing Moscow to any specific action in support of Iran. The gap between that public position and the intelligence sharing that American officials were confirming was the space in which Russia was conducting the most consequential intervention in the conflict that any external power had made. Consequential precisely because it was deniable, because it operated below the threshold of direct military engagement, and because the American administration had demonstrated it was not prepared to impose costs on Russia for conducting it. The Russian consulate in Isfahan took a direct hit during U.S.-Israeli airstrikes against Iranian military infrastructure in the city, an incident whose diplomatic implications landed in a specific category that neither Washington nor Moscow had any interest in managing publicly with the clarity the event demanded. The consulate was damaged rather than destroyed, and no Russian diplomatic personnel were reported among the casualties in the immediate aftermath. But the physical striking of a Russian diplomatic facility by American-supplied munitions in the context of a conflict where Russia was simultaneously providing targeting intelligence to the forces being struck represented a collision of the conflict's multiple simultaneous dimensions that the diplomatic language available to both governments was not designed to handle. Russia condemned the strikes on Iranian territory generally. The specific damage to its consulate received considerably more muted treatment in Russian official communications than the broader condemnation would have suggested was warranted. The restraint was deliberate and its logic was transparent. Acknowledging the consulate strike as a Russian grievance requiring a Russian response would have required either escalating the response or publicly absorbing the insult, and neither option served the strategic positioning Moscow was trying to maintain. The specific character of Russia's involvement in the conflict, providing intelligence that helped Iran target American forces while publicly condemning the war and calling for ceasefire, accepting damage to its own diplomatic facilities without demanding accountability, declining to comment on intelligence sharing that American officials were confirming, reflected a strategic calculation whose internal logic was coherent even if its public expression was deliberately obscured. Russia was not in a position to militarily confront the United States and Israel in the Middle East. Its military resources were committed in Ukraine. Its naval capability in the Black Sea had been degraded by Ukrainian strikes, and the direct confrontation with American forces that meaningful military support for Iran would have required carried escalatory risks that Moscow was not prepared to accept. What Russia could do, and was doing, was provide the kind of support that imposed costs on American operations without crossing the threshold that would have required an American response that Moscow could not manage. Intelligence sharing sits in exactly that category. It is consequential in operational terms, deniable in diplomatic terms, and difficult to respond to without creating escalation dynamics that the responding party has to manage. The economic dimension of Russia's interest in the conflict's continuation added another layer to the intelligence sharing calculation that the purely military analysis of the arrangement missed. Every day that the Strait of Hormuz remained closed, every week that Gulf energy infrastructure remained under threat, every month that the conflict sustained the uncertainty premium that had been driving oil prices toward levels not seen in 4 decades, all of this was generating revenue for Russia at a rate that partially compensated for the economic costs of its Ukraine commitments. Russian analysts had been explicit about this calculation from the conflict's opening days. One Russian State Duma member had expressed hope that the United States would become preoccupied with Iran and forget about Ukraine. Polish defense minister had warned that a prolonged Middle East conflict would jeopardize arms supplies to Ukraine and provide an economic boost to Russia through elevated energy prices. Both observations were accurate assessments of the same dynamic, a dynamic that Russia had every incentive to sustain and no incentive to help resolve. The asymmetry in how Russia and the United States were experiencing the conflict's costs was the structural feature that made the intelligence sharing arrangement strategically rational from Moscow's perspective, even at the risk of the diplomatic exposure that confirmation by American officials created. Russia was receiving elevated oil revenues while providing intelligence that cost it nothing in military terms. The United States was sustaining military casualties, depleting interceptor inventories, managing the economic consequences of the energy disruption for its own consumers and allies, and handling the political fallout of a conflict that had entered its second month without achieving its stated objectives. Russia's consulate had taken a hit, an event that created a diplomatic grievance Moscow could hold and deploy at a moment of its choosing without requiring an immediate response that would have clarified Moscow's position in ways that strategic ambiguity was currently making unnecessary. The damage to the consulate was, from a certain perspective, a resource rather than a cost, an entry in a ledger that Moscow could reference when the conflict eventually reached a diplomatic resolution phase that required negotiating with Washington about the terms of whatever came next. The intelligence sharing story also revealed something about the broader relationship between Russia and the United States in this conflict that the official framing on both sides was carefully avoiding stating directly. Washington was conducting military operations against a country that Russia had described as its strategic partner, destroying infrastructure that Russia had built, killing military personnel that Russia had trained and equipped, and doing all of this in a region where Russian interests were directly engaged, while simultaneously managing the Ukraine conflict, the economic relationship with China, and the domestic political pressures that the energy price consequences of the Iran war were generating. Moscow was providing targeting data to forces firing at American military personnel while publicly calling for ceasefire and declining to confirm or deny its intelligence activities, calibrating its involvement to maximize the costs it could impose on American operations without providing Washington with a clear enough provocation to justify the response that a more overt intervention would have demanded. The two governments were, in the specific language of strategic competition, engaged in a proxy confrontation whose dynamics neither was prepared to acknowledge publicly, but that both were managing with the awareness that the other was fully aware of what was happening. The F-35 shooting down a Russian-made Iranian Yak-130 fighter jet over Tehran on March 4th added a dimension to the Russia-US dynamic in this conflict that the intelligence sharing story had been building toward, but that neither government had been prepared for in quite this form. The IDF announced it matter-of-factly. An F-35I Adir had engaged and destroyed a Russian-manufactured Iranian aircraft in air-to-air combat over the Iranian capital, marking the first time in history that a stealth fighter had shot down a manned aircraft in combat, and the first time the Israeli Air Force had shot down an aircraft since 1985. The operational significance of the engagement was considerable in its own right, a demonstration that the F-35's sensor fusion and weapons integration performed exactly as designed in a contested airspace environment against a real adversary rather than a test-range target. But the geopolitical dimension of the engagement was what made it strategically significant beyond the tactical result. An American-built Israeli aircraft had just destroyed a Russian-built Iranian aircraft in the airspace of a country where Russia had stationed technical personnel, delivered advanced weapon systems, and was actively providing satellite intelligence to help that country's forces kill American military personnel. The layers of proxy involvement that both Russia and the United States had been carefully managing below the threshold of direct confrontation had just produced their first kinetic intersection. Russia's response to the Yak-130 shootdown followed the same pattern of calibrated restraint that had characterized its response to the consulate damage, acknowledging the event without demanding accountability, registering it as a data point in a ledger rather than responding to it as a provocation requiring immediate action. The Yak-130 is a Russian-designed trainer and light attack aircraft, whose presence in Iranian service reflected the depth of the Russia-Iran military relationship without representing a frontline combat platform whose loss carried the same symbolic weight as a more capable system would have. Russia could absorb the loss of a Russian-manufactured aircraft in Iranian service without the domestic political pressure to respond that the loss of Russian-crewed or Russian-flagged assets would have generated. But the pattern of absorbed insults was accumulating: consulate damaged, Russian-built aircraft destroyed, Russian intelligence operations confirmed in American press, and the accumulation was being noted in every capital that was tracking Moscow's actual behavior against its public positioning. The U.S. submarine sinking of the Iranian frigate Dina off the coast of Sri Lanka on March 4th added a geographic dimension to the conflict that no previous engagement had reached. The Dina was returning from the International Fleet Review in Visakhapatnam, India, when a U.S. submarine engaged and sank it, killing 87 of its crew. The operation demonstrated American submarine capability to project force at distances from the main conflict theater that Iran had not been required to account for in its operational planning. And it sent a message to every naval force in the region and beyond about the reach of American undersea warfare capability that operated independently of the surface force concentrations that had been the primary focus of the conflict's naval dimension. Russia's Caspian flotilla, whose positioning relative to the conflict's geography had been a subject of analysis since the Bandar Anzali strike, was tracking all of these engagements and incorporating them into assessments whose implications for Russian naval positioning in the broader strategic environment were not being publicly discussed, but were clearly being privately calculated. The Ukrainian dimension of the conflict's Russia angle added a layer that Western coverage was consistently underweighting. Zelensky had confirmed that Russia was conducting surveillance of American bases in the Middle East using satellite and electronic intelligence capabilities, information that Ukrainian military intelligence had collected and shared with American counterparts through the intelligence sharing arrangements that the Ukraine conflict had built between Kyiv and Washington. The irony of Ukraine providing intelligence about Russian intelligence operations against American forces in the Middle East, in a conflict whose opening had been welcomed by Russian officials as a development that would distract Washington from Ukraine, was not lost on analysts tracking both conflicts simultaneously. Russia's calculation that the Iran war would cause America to forget about Ukraine was being complicated by the depth of the intelligence relationship that the Ukraine war had created between Washington and Kyiv, a relationship that was now generating information flows relevant to the Iran conflict that Moscow had not anticipated when it assessed the strategic benefits of the Middle East distraction. The broader strategic picture that assembled from Russia's intelligence sharing, the consulate damage, the Yak-130 shootdown, the submarine sinking of the Iris Dina, and the Ukrainian intelligence confirmation was one that the official narratives of all governments involved were struggling to contain within their preferred framings. Washington was managing a conflict in which a nuclear power was actively helping the adversary target American military personnel, while the administration publicly downplayed the arrangement and declined to impose costs on Moscow for conducting it. The calculation behind that restraint was visible even if it was not publicly stated. Imposing costs on Russia for the intelligence sharing would have required either diplomatic measures that complicated the Ukraine negotiation track, economic measures that generated domestic costs. The administration was not prepared to absorb on top of the energy price consequences of the Iran war itself, or military measures that carried escalatory risks nobody wanted to model publicly. The path of least immediate resistance was to acknowledge the intelligence sharing through anonymous officials, publicly downplay its operational significance, and continue the conflict on the assumption that degrading Iranian military capacity faster than Russian intelligence could compensate for the degradation was the most viable route to the outcome Washington needed. Iran's position in this specific dynamic was the one receiving the least analytical attention relative to its strategic significance. Tehran was receiving satellite intelligence from Moscow about American military positioning, drone and missile technology upgrades from Russian engineering, food and commodity supplies through the Caspian corridor before the Bandar Anzali strike disrupted it, and diplomatic cover in international forums where Russian condemnation of the war as unprovoked aggression provided political oxygen to Iranian resistance. In exchange, Iran was absorbing the military costs of being the primary target of the most intensive American and Israeli air campaign since Iraq in 2003, sustaining thousands of military casualties, losing most of its missile production capacity, watching its nuclear infrastructure get struck, and managing the political transition following Khamenei's assassination, while simultaneously launching hundreds of missiles and drones at Israeli cities and American military bases across the region. The Russia-Iran relationship in this conflict was not a relationship between equals. Russia was extracting strategic benefits: elevated oil revenues, American distraction from Ukraine, intelligence about American military operations, while Iran was absorbing the kinetic costs. Whether Tehran's leadership was making a clear-eyed assessment of that asymmetry, or whether the support Russia was providing was sufficient to sustain the belief that Moscow's backing was genuine rather than opportunistic, was a question whose answer would shape the conflict's diplomatic endgame. The diplomatic track that Pakistan was managing between Washington and Tehran carried its own Russia dimension that the public reporting on the negotiations had not fully explored. The 15-point American plan conveyed to Iran through Pakistani intermediaries represented an attempt to define the terms of a conflict resolution that would produce the outcome Washington had launched the war to achieve: verifiable elimination of Iran's nuclear weapons capability, without requiring the indefinite continuation of military operations whose costs were accumulating in ways the American domestic political environment was not indefinitely sustainable. Russia's interest in that negotiation was not aligned with Washington's interest in its rapid conclusion. A negotiated settlement that ended the Hormuz closure, restored Gulf energy supply stability, and removed the Middle East as a primary consumer of American strategic attention would eliminate the strategic benefits that Russia had been extracting from the conflict's continuation. Moscow's incentive was to sustain the conditions that were generating those benefits for as long as possible, which meant providing enough support to Iran to prevent rapid capitulation while avoiding the kind of direct involvement that would force Washington to prioritize confronting Russian behavior over managing the Iran negotiation. The conflict had entered its 30th day in a configuration that reflected this multi-party strategic calculus operating simultaneously. Iran was still launching missiles. The Strait of Hormuz remained closed to normal commercial traffic. American interceptor inventories were depleted and resupply was constrained. Russia was providing satellite intelligence and receiving elevated oil revenues. China was signing yuan-denominated energy agreements and watching American strategic bandwidth get consumed in the Middle East. Pakistan was mediating negotiations whose outcome no party was publicly committing to. NATO had declined to help secure the strait. Trump had called the alliance a paper tiger. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all these simultaneous dynamics, the question of what this conflict would actually produce for Iran, for Israel, for the United States, for Russia, and for the global economic order whose stability the conflict was methodically eroding remained as genuinely open on day 30 as it had been on day 1. Leave one question in the comments. Do you think Russia's intelligence sharing with Iran, confirmed by American officials, downplayed by the Pentagon, denied by the Kremlin, represents the most dangerous undeclared dimension of this conflict? Every response gets read, evidence first, analysis second. You decide what it means. Subscribe and turn on notifications. When the Pakistan-mediated negotiations produce a public outcome, when Washington decides whether to impose costs on Moscow for the intelligence sharing, when the accumulated ledger of Russian consulate damage and Russian-built aircraft destroyed forces the Kremlin to publicly clarify its position, and when the 30-day war that was supposed to last 72 hours reaches the moment that determines what it actually accomplished, the analysis will be here.